Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining our webinar today. If you're just getting in, we'll give you a minute or two to get settled while everybody comes into the webinar room. I'll go ahead and kick us off with a welcome. So hello and welcome. We're thrilled to have you at today's forum. It's entitled Exploring the Impact of Racial Trauma on the Health and Well-Being of Children. This is probably the fourth that we've done in our racial equity series, Motivo partnering with Anthem for these. My name is Rachel McCrickard. I'm the CEO and founder of Motivo. I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Motivo, I'll just quickly say that we are an online virtual clinical supervision platform, have a network of about 1,000 clinical supervisors, a couple of who are on our panel today, and we partner with behavioral health organizations to provide quality, accessible clinical supervision. And we're excited about today because this is actually the first time that we are offering continuing education credit on behalf of Motivo. So this panel has been approved by the National Board of Certified Counselors for 1.5 CE credits. And in order to obtain, this part's really important, in order to obtain the CE credit, you must complete the survey that we will send you in the follow-up email. So everybody who registered will get the follow-up email. Just make sure that you complete the continuing education survey there to verify your attendance today. And we have 3 incredible panelists to lead us into this really important discussion. But before we dive in, I just want to quickly say thank you to Anthem. They've partnered with us on today's event and many other events like this. And Anthem has just shown such dedication to speaking up on the important issue of racial justice and racial equity. And we're just so proud to partner with Anthem for today's event. I'm going to pass it over to my friend, Meryl Friedman, and she's going to say a few words about Anthem.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Meryl Friedman, as Rachel said, and I lead inclusive policy advocacy here at Anthem. We truly are thrilled to have that you've chosen, right, to join us for the discussion today. And I've got to say, I mean, every time we do one of these sessions throughout, this is our 4th. I was trying to think back. It's so important that we come together to have deeper conversations about racial equity. And today to actually be talking about the impact of racial trauma on children and adolescents. We need to be here. What more can I say? We need to be here. I encourage us to stay focused on the topic and focused on the health and well-being of young people well beyond this forum. So hopefully there'll be some follow-up. And so as we craft these, I want to thank everyone who included a question in your registration. We do use those to shape the content. And we also ask you at the end to fill out the survey. So you'll get the continuing education survey, but there is a survey at the end of the forum just about today's forum. And your feedback is really super important to us. And we use it to inform the topics and build out the content for the upcoming forums. So we're doing 1 a quarter. So tell us what you want to learn more about. But again, thank you for being here. Thank you for your commitment to young people and to equity. And I'm going to turn it over to my fabulous colleague and friend, Dr. Malloy, and the incredible panelists, Dr. Carla Smith and Dr. Brown James. So over to you, Dr. Malloy.
Great, thank you so much. Well, hello, everyone. I'm really excited to join you again today, all of the committed providers that continue with us on this journey and to do the work and talk with us about this. And for anyone new who's joining, hopefully this has been a topic that has been brought up by other participants on other calls. And so we're always trying to build on and add more knowledge. And so today we're talking about exploring the impact of racial trauma on the health and well-being of children in particular as part of our series. And I'll say a note about myself and then a note about our fantastic panelists and then let them give you a little bit more background as we roll into our first kinds of questioning and beginning of the discussion. So just to reintroduce myself, I'm Dr. Demetria Malloy. I'm one of the medical director, regional vice presidents for Anthem's national account teams and have held other leadership positions in Anthem with other teams as well. I'm focusing a lot on clinical collaborations and driving performance there, and also on building clinical programs out and health equity in particular underneath those clinical programs and making sure we administer our programs to our population, our members, as best as possible across the board. So I will start with one of the people who have joined us before, which is Dr. Carla Smith, and she joins us from Atlanta, Georgia. And Dr. Carla Smith is a licensed clinical social worker and MFT with a PhD in human development and family science and an MSW. And she works primarily now these days with Brownstone Consulting in Atlanta. And that really focuses on diversity and inclusion and sees her clients as well with that and works on a number of clinical programs there. And then I'm also really excited to introduce someone who's first with us for this kind of forum with Anthem, but has actually been working with Motivo for a while. So we were fortunate to be able to have her time today. And that's Dr. Letitia Brown James. She's also got a PhD and she's a counselor as well, and a certified counselor and assistant professor at Adler Graduate School. And she can say a little bit more about that. And it's specializing, she's in a number of areas, including multiculturalism, clinical administration, supervision, advocacy, and a lot of the intersections between physical and mental health that we'll be discussing today. So really excited to add her expertise as well. And with that, I'll just get us rolling to talk about what some of these ladies have been experiencing in their practice, in their research, and their experience. And the fact that we talk about the term racial trauma, we always like to start with the language that we're using for the day and say, what is it that we have as a common understanding of what does racial trauma mean when we're talking about how that shows up in the room for you providers and clinicians when your clients and your patients come in. And to say, why is that important for us as clinicians and care providers to understand? And I really want these women to speak about how it is that their work and expertise has brought them to sort of find this as an important topic, especially to focus that education for providers today. So I will start with Dr. Smith.
Yeah, so I'll give you the definition of racial trauma. And what racial trauma is, you also hear it or see it in the literature as race-based traumatic stress. And it basically refers to kind of the emotional, psychological, mental, sometimes physical injuries that we experience based on encounters of, racial bias, of stereotyping, hate crimes, systemic racism, experiences of discrimination, and really present themselves in different ways. These can be based in mood disorders, as well as just kind of look specifically like trauma. These are things that, impact our sleep, our appetites, our ability to engage in social experiences. They can cause anxiety, depression. And so based in different age groups, there are different ways to experience. And so we'll get to that in just a bit. This is important to me, both personally and professionally. Professionally, I have been studying just the impact of racial identity development across the lifespan, and more specifically, ways to counteract racial trauma. And some of that is in ethnic identity development and looking at a deeper sense of self and the ways in which heritage and culture, as well as, family and connection can actually be something to focus on and create pride that then, counteracts what some of the impacts of race and race-based trauma are in our society. Personally, I have also been, I've experienced racial trauma throughout various systems, including the healthcare system, including as a client for mental health treatment. And so, it's not only my experience, but also trying to change an experience that I foresee for my children, and being able to change and impact society in ways where they will not experience the same things that I have, but that, again, instilling that pride and being able to have a positive sense of self that is based in racial identity and ethnic identity can be something to just kind of, counteract what happens in society.
Thank you. And certainly understanding that importance of that is a good backdrop for any of our providers to have. Dr. Brown James, do you have any comments as well on racial trauma, the definition, and how that's really come up in your work and why it's important for providers to understand that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. In addition to what Dr. Smith said, I think it's important to not separate it from any other type of trauma. Most people know what PTSD means. If someone experiences like a really bad car accident or they witness a violent shooting or something, it's easy they were in the military. It's easy for people to associate that type of trauma and say like, oh, okay, I can see why this person may be suffering from PTSD or have PTSD symptoms, or even other mental health symptoms, behavioral symptoms, depression, anxiety, but not really in my work. I haven't really seen where people, the average person, not clinicians, and even some clinicians struggle with it too, associating race-based trauma with having traumatic responses. They're not understanding or not linking it to the way the person is presenting, whether it's a child or an adult. If they are referred to them for services, they sometimes don't make that connection. And being aware of that and digging a little bit deeper, we can understand why, okay, this person is presenting this way or that way, but there's nothing else that we can link it to, so I don't know what's going on. But oftentimes, if you dig a little deeper, have that awareness to understand how race-based experiences can be traumatic, then it's easier to see the connection and then basically move forward with that person, helping them to resolve that trauma that they've experienced.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to piggyback on what you just brought up around how it might present, and it could be very similar to other, trauma that people have been trained around. How might it show up in a provider, clinician's officer relationship, in children and adolescents a little bit more too, because it can be undeveloped or not really, expressed in a certain way or not. And how is it that people might look for that or see that show up in that group?
Is that a question for me or for any
Yes,
of us?
I'm following up on that last comment
Okay.
too. Sorry, Dr. Brown James.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to make sure. Well, how I've seen it present is oftentimes kids don't really have the words to explain what's happening. They may not even understand what's happening, but what they do know is that they're being treated very differently in the classroom. There's one study that I had done read as a part of a literature review that I did for a study that I was working on, where it was talking about race-based, specifically racial microaggressions, right? But race-based experiences that kids across the spectrum have in schools, right? So for example, one kid that is, let's say, a Black male child, right, is doing very well in school and he gets A's, and he's asked questions like, did you cheat? Or do you have a tutor? And the classmate that is of the same age, that is usually white or, maybe Hispanic or something, may not have that same experience, even though they did equally well. And so talking to kids about, well, why don't you want to go to school? Or why are you being sent to the principal's office, or, getting in trouble at school? And then really talking with them, engaging in like some art therapy or play therapy, it can come out that that's what's happening, but without them actually saying that I think my teacher is targeting me because I'm fill in the blank, whatever the race is, and then you learn as you dive a little bit deeper into it, that their experiences or even their behaviors are because of a race-based traumatic response that they're having based on their lived experiences in that setting. I hope that answers your question.
Certainly. And I think it also could, frame expectations for how those same children would work with any other adult authority figures, including, right, their primary care provider, like their pediatrician, et cetera, or their expectation of how they might be treated. And so to understand that, right, there could be a default defensive nature or something like that that might show in, that might want to pay attention to, as opposed to attesting that behavior to something else and considering that as one of the root causes. Dr. Smith, do you have more to add about that, on how it might show up in the clinician's office? And then, sometimes I think it's different by different age groups and age bands as well. So if you can comment there.
Yeah, so similar to what Dr. Brown James was saying, there are so many different ways in which we can be tuned into there being something deeper. Children, don't have the language to say I was discriminated against, or, I'm being treated poorly because someone else who looks like me or has the same race did something, quote unquote bad in class. So this is going to be developmental based on what, the age of the child. So infants and toddlers do still experience racial trauma, but again, as connected to their primary care providers, the nurturing figures in their life, it is based in the experiences that they have. So we see a lot of vicarious trauma, and also the ways in which they value themselves based in what they see and what they're exposed to. And then moving on to children that have language, but yet are still unable to, really understand what is going on for them. We're looking at preschoolers. And so what preschoolers tend to do is act out things. So they tend to act out, we'll see with, 3 to 5 year olds, we'll see them act out the experiences with police that they're hearing about. They're hearing about police brutality. So for example, a child that I was seeing using a sand tray and having the police consistently be fighting the Black man who was also a figure. And so this is something that continues to be acted out, even if they didn't necessarily experience it or see what was going on. They hear the adults in their life talking about it. School age children, ages 6 to 11, are still really trying to grapple with what the adults in their life, the people in their life are experiencing. But we also see in this age a connection between what's good and what's bad. And so that internal devaluation of self, it begins to play out in what they believe about themselves, what they think about themselves, the belief of their abilities, the hope of themselves. And so then we start to see acting out. Right. So if I'm going to, end up being a bad person anyway, or if I am a bad person anyway, let my actions go along with that. If I'm going to get in trouble anyway, let me just go ahead and do that. Ages 6 to 11-year-olds are also pretty hypervigilant about safety. They begin to worry about their own safety if they are hearing a lot about the lack of safety for people of color. And so we begin to see with, again, 6 to 11-year-olds, places where they begin to worry or have anxiety where they're going places, right? They might decide, they're learning in school to go up to a police officer if they are lost. And then they start to worry, well, what if I am lost, but I can't trust the police officer or the school or the counselor or the principal to do what's in my best interest. And then we see 12 to 17-year-olds where they are in a very, very important place of identity development. And there is internalization of the views of being, whatever race they are, a person of color, start to be internalized. We also are seeing higher prevalences of anxiety and depression in adolescents of color. And so these can be a range of emotions that are based in the ways in which the world see them. And as they get closer to launching or leaving school, or leaving the home, maybe they are going into the military, or they're going to college, or, going to travel the world. They begin to be much more conscious of how others view them. And that begins to be internalized throughout their identity development process.
Well, that seems like a lot and heavy for young kids to carry, right? When they're already dealing with, just trying to develop and become a grown human being, to actually also have that on top and really sort of put limits and caps on what you think you can do, your opportunities, how you think of yourself in the world, and how people value or don't value you. I think it's important for us to sort of turn to and say more about maybe what providers, when they see this or they are assessing for this, how they can maybe assess for that, and things that they can do to, buffer against that, because they can't control all the messages that other adults are giving them in the world, but they certainly can for that really important primary relationship as well, and be another adult figure that buffers against that or provides something else. Dr. Brown James, can you say some more about how providers can either look for this, assess this, and then what they can do when they're noticing that this is an important pattern in their child patient?
Of course. Yes. Well, like Dr. Smith said, of course, we want to look at this developmentally, based on where the child is developmentally. So for the younger kids, oftentimes you will see it show up in their play, whether it is a play therapy situation or not. Just pay attention if there are young kids that you're taking care of, just pay attention to their conversations, to what they're doing, maybe asking them about their favorite toys and what do they like to do. Also in the form of a story, or, having them draw a picture. Sometimes it'll come out in that way. And quite frankly, just asking them, in an age appropriate way, for example, what are some things that make you feel scared sometimes, or some things that you're concerned about or worry about, and they'll tell you. And sometimes they'll just tell you without being prompted. Very recently, I had a kid in my life ask me if I like the police, and I said, yeah. I was taken off guard by the question. So I said, yeah, why did you ask that question? And they said, well, because police are bad. And I said, oh, they are? And this was a young child. So I said, well, why do you say that? Like, why do you think police are bad? So we just had a conversation. And what it was is that he had been watching television, like we talked about earlier, with his parents last year, when it was all over the news, what was going on with police brutality and race-based, people having race-based encounters with police officers that were not pleasant, right? And then of course with George Floyd and so forth. So we had a conversation about it. And what I said to him was, well, sometimes police, just like anyone, may do bad things, but it doesn't mean that police are bad. Police are people that we can trust and we can go to. And so we just had a conversation about it. And I asked him if he understood what I was saying. And he said yes. So sometimes they will bring it up. And, even though I was taken aback, like I didn't have a huge response to it, I just kind of talked to him in a way to make him feel safe. Because oftentimes, especially with conversations like that, the kids may feel like, if I say this, will I get in trouble? I'm not really sure how to go. So really keeping that calm presence, non-judgmental presence, and asking questions to get more information, because you also don't want to make your own interpretation or even be on the defense. For example, if someone that you love is a police officer, and you're tired of hearing the negative things that, people are saying and doing about or towards police officers, but just really monitoring yourself and trying to get information from the person, because again, their experiences are their experiences and their perceptions are their perceptions. So you want to find out where they're coming from and where you can fill in some of the gaps, and moving forward in an age appropriate way. I know I've said that a lot, but it's really crucial to do that, because you don't want to overwhelm them too much with information, more than they need to know. And I always tell parents, please, and caregivers, please, if you can, limit your kids' exposure to what is going on. Like you want to make them aware, right? So that they can be vigilant and so forth. But again, in an age appropriate manner, and not exposing them to too much information, whether wittingly or unwittingly, because sometimes the parent or the caregiver, they're just having a conversation with another adult, perhaps, right? Or it's on the TV, it's in the movies that we watch, different things like that. But really being conscious that you want to limit that type of information, some of the information that we see and hear from our kids, because they just don't need to have all of that information, because it can promote, a vicarious traumatic response.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Smith, what are some of the tactics that you've used with some of the assessment and then response to what you see in the assessment of where a child is at with this kind of topic?
Yeah, I think, it's so hard to know, what to say, given that, all children are different, all people are different. People experience, people's racialized experiences are different based on, the color of their skin, their country of origin, how race is even talked about in their home, again, in country of origin. So there's so much diversity there that it's actually kind of minimizing to say like, oh, this is what you say, right? And so I think one of the best things to do is to just kind of make sure that you are always building a connection, right? That it's in the relationship that safety is built. And that's what it takes. Safety is one of the major differences that we can provide to children, to adolescents. And in safety, that means that there is cultural humility. There is this understanding that I don't know your experience, so help me understand. If I perceive my client to be a person of color, or I know them to be a person of color, a person who identifies as Black, multiracial, biracial, Latinx, that means that brings to memory, that brings to mind that there is a marginalized experience that people in this country who identify as people of color have. And so that is just because of not only my experiences, but also my engagement with what's going on around us. We are all somehow engaged. And so if we decide to, as adults, to ignore it, then that also means that we're not going to be able to know how to engage and how to build a relationship, and just to ask a general question, just as we would know the differences among, the weather outside, right? We can outright ask, and acknowledge that there are different lived experiences for people of color. And so, knowledge comes with that, but also always being facing the other and not situating yourself just in your experience means that we can further ask questions. Just like we have to ask uncomfortable questions about suicidality, about substance use, about past experiences of sexual trauma, for example. Asking questions about race and racialized experiences are also uncomfortable, and leaning into that discomfort means that we have to figure out a way to, ask the question, where's the space? If a person goes to school or a child goes to school, who's your friend? What race is your friend? And do y'all talk about race? Do you talk about race at home? And I feel like these are questions that we can ask all kids, no matter what our perception of their race is. We all as adults just have to be more comfortable with the discomfort of talking about race. And at this point in time, in this society, in this country, we are uncomfortable, and that just is what it is. And so we just have to lean into that. We also, kind of alluding to just kind of like a knowledge base, just like we would expect ourselves as mental health providers, as healthcare providers, to know the prevalence of X in the populations that we serve. If we serve adolescents, for example, we have to know the prevalence of anxiety and depression that triples because of a person who's also experiencing discrimination, as well as stereotypes. That's on us to know. And so these are places that this knowledge, as well as this goal of building an authentic relationship that fosters safety, where, children and adolescents can see us as a kind of like a safe person to say, I think my teacher doesn't like me because I'm Black. Or, the teacher, a child close to me told me that almost every day the teacher would say only to him that if you don't sit down, I'm going to call the police. And that there's like this feeling that comes up, and the safety of saying, I don't think that this is right. I mean, I'm a child, but it doesn't feel good. And I don't like the way I feel in class when this is said to me, and not, and it's not said to other people. So it's about safety, and, I don't want to repeat myself, but basically that's kind of where it is. It's uncomfortable, lean into it.
I think those are really important things. I mean, that we were trained on some of the other areas, I think, but it's important to note that we don't train on this area, right? So that increases that sort of that cycle of it being uncomfortable and then not being addressed, right? Because there maybe aren't particular tools around it, but then that really affects the health outcomes. And you guys in your expertise have been peppering in different statistics and things that the research shows about the connections between racial trauma, discrimination, and how children and adolescents experience mental health and physical health. I will bring up one area in particular that I think does have a pretty wide body of research on it. And, they call it ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And in that, there are sort of 3 categories of like physical abuse and neglect, et cetera, and household dysfunction. And one of the subcategories underneath there is discrimination, right? So it's acknowledged that if there are any discriminatory patterns, and they didn't call out specifically racial discrimination, but of any sort, right? Because it could be based on whether you identify as cisgender or transgender, or, what area you're in, any sort of discrimination that the child experiences and notes is also directly related to their risk of mental health issues and physical health issues, and then how their disease course might even play out because of those exacerbating factors. So there's definitely research that links to these different childhood experiences, including discrimination, and how this plays out directly in the things that, us as providers and the providers on this call would encounter. So I welcome people to look at those things and that research that is out there, just like you would on anything else, to your point, Dr. Smith. I'd like to focus more a little bit too on, I think I agree with you on it's hard to know exactly what to say. It may be easier to ask the question of like, what don't you say? So like paying attention to things that you might be saying that you unintentionally are harmful, or, are sort of not the appropriate ways to maybe deal with it or address it or bring it up, or good language to use. And so it could be useful to help the providers on this call with things that they may be doing that unintentionally actually lead to other harm, or close that relationship off from feeling safe, or a place where children can actually express that. Dr. Brown James, can you say something about that for the providers on the call?
Yes, I have so much to say, so I'm going to try and make it as concise as possible. One of my favorite ways to answer a question like this is to address the elephant in the room. Okay, whether the elephant in the room is race, gender, it doesn't matter. And it doesn't have to be awkward. Like Dr. Smith said, it's uncomfortable to talk about, right? But like with anything else, the more you practice, the easier it gets. So and you don't have to bring it up in an awkward way. Even if you're going over an intake and you're looking at the person's demographics or something, you could say something like, I see that you checked whatever the box is that they check related to race and or ethnicity. Can you tell me what your experience has been like, right? If it's a cross-racial relationship, you can ask something like, what is it like for you to work with someone who looks like me? What are your experiences? And, questions like that can make it non-threatening. And if you bring it up as the provider, it'll usually, in my experience, it helps clients, even if there is some type of anxiety or angst about it, it helps to bring that down, because one, they see that you notice them and you notice the difference, right? So think about how many times we've seen, whether on social media or on the news or whatever, when a race-based experience happens and people get really upset, they will say things like, why do we always have to make it about race? Why do we talk about race? But the thing is, we can't. Yes, we all are human beings, right? But there are certain intricacies related to race-based experiences. And like Dr. Smith mentioned earlier, cultural humility is so important, right? So basically, my really quick stance on cultural humility is that you are not expected, it's impossible for us all to know every single thing about every single person, every single culture, right? And it's okay. It is okay to not know. And so even if you think you know about a particular culture or a person's cultural experiences, it's really important to individualize that experience by asking them to share. But share, you don't want them to tell you their whole life story or put the burden on them to educate you, but it is important to ask what is their individualized experience like? What is it like for you as a Black male, as a Asian American female, however they identify, to give them the opportunity to say that, and certainly one of the, you asked earlier what to not do, definitely under no circumstance try not to invalidate a person's experience. Even if it's very different than your own, it's very foreign because you haven't experienced that. Their experience is their experience, their perception is their perception. And the quickest way to get someone to become quote unquote resistance, which I really don't like that word in healthcare, because I think it's used too much and it's used in the wrong context, where a person's quote unquote resistance could be their self-preservation mechanism because they don't feel safe to share whatever it is that may be going on. And they may not feel comfortable asking questions. Also, within some cultures, it may be perceived as disrespectful to question your provider. So their lack of questioning or their lack of follow through may not be resistance, but it could be a cultural piece that we're missing. And until we address that elephant in the room to approach their treatment, it's not going to get better.
Thank you for that. Dr. Smith, I'm sure you have some notes on this as well. Language to stay away from, approaches to try and avoid when you are trying to, build up your repertoire, your ability to be better at this with your clients and patients.
Yeah, I think the major thing is around belief. If you are communicating that you do not believe what a client is experiencing or what a person is experiencing, then that's going to be communicated. So if you do believe it, it's communicated in curiosity and asking questions and exploring and processing. If you don't believe it, then that is also communicated as well. So belief is the first thing. I also think that when we operate from our biases, then we also use the language of stereotypes. So, that then obviously talking about stereotypes is harmful. And so that's something to definitely stay away from. But more importantly, operating within our biases without us knowing. So, just assuming that someone who looks like me has the same experiences that I do. And so I'm not asking them the same questions that I might ask someone who I assume to be different racially than I. That's problematic. And also disempowering language. Children and adolescents know themselves. They are just as much experts on themselves as an adult. And so if you are a person who, for example, if a child or an adolescent tells you something, and instead of asking them more questions, then you go to the adult in their life to get more explanation, or to even just talk to them about it, and you talk around them, or you talk as if they don't understand, or you use language that they don't understand, or an explanation that they don't understand, it then disempowers them. And it is empowerment that will help them when they are by themselves dealing with issues of discrimination, racial trauma, systemic racism. And so, as we begin to think about our biases and our perceptions about children and adolescents, toddlers, for example, a 2-year-old, can a 2-year-old teach us something and we believe that they can't, or an adolescent is just being emotional, or an adolescent is being impulsive, and that's why they did what they did, then that is stunting our ability to believe them, which again, belief is one of the major aspects of safety when it comes to talking about race and racism.
Definitely. I think, just as any patient or client with a provider would want, they'd want the space to be themselves and be able to work with you to craft their care plan, right? That's best for maximizing their health and addressing their needs. So you got to set the stage for that and clear things out of the way that get in the way for that. And all of us have biases that do that. We just have to be aware of them and clear them out of the way so they don't get in the way to achieving those goals with our patients. So I certainly hear that there. I'm wondering if you guys have notes on how gender or class also might play into this. You alluded to this with Dr. Smith with saying, not everybody's experience is the same, even within what might seem like a more racially homogenous group or something. So being able to tease those pieces out, because those play into the experiences as well, and allow for that individuality while still having, race or assessments of racial trauma in the context, right, as well. Dr. Brown James, do you have notes to say about how gender or class might play into this, or how to make sure we account for that when we're talking to class?
Right. Well, it's certainly a part of the equation, because usually, very rarely, are these experiences isolated to just race. There's usually an intersection with the demographics that you mentioned: class, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, all of those things. And so really taking that into consideration. And sometimes a person may say that they don't know if they had a negative experience somewhere, right? They don't necessarily know, was I targeted because of my race? Was I targeted because of my gender, my religion, or a combination of both? So I think one of the key things is understanding that we can't separate them, and, keeping into our minds that there may be an intersecting piece going on there that needs to be attended to, and just help the person process it in whatever way that they can, and tell their story, and just try to support them as best as you can using a trauma informed lens. Oftentimes, using storytelling or some type of bibliography of some sort where the person can write their story, even if it's, or even journaling, even if it's just getting it out and sharing it on paper, can help them. Because sometimes too, it's so convoluted and it's so overwhelming, even in their own minds and in their own emotions, that just keeping it all bottled up is really hard to kind of sort through. And so helping them express it in a different way. It could also be expressed in music, whatever method may help them, to articulate what's going on and to process it. But certainly we can't separate their intersecting identities when we're having this discussion.
Definitely. Dr. Smith, how have you seen gender and class also play into this and the assessment of this and sort of making that care plan more holistic?
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of the intersection of class, kind of for a long time, forever, without very little conversation about the intersection of class. The disparities in class difference versus race difference are things that we just kind of don't talk enough about. But so we are seeing much more instances of, powerlessness, of voicelessness at the intersection of class. Also, gender identity, right? So gender identity development also happens in adolescence. And so the meaning that children and adolescents are making of their gender identity could be something, if they are cisgender, that is an experience that they have privilege in. But if they are not, or they are questioning their gender identity, then we're also talking about pretty deeply rooted intersections of discrimination, of systemic oppression that can be seen at the government levels. There's been a lot more kind of conversations about adolescents' choice and children's choice of gender. And so as we begin to learn and know the people that we're seeing and that we're working with, we have to know that no matter the race of the person, of the child, of the adolescent, that there's also multiple layers of identity formation that they are experiencing at different ages. And so it's not just about talking about race, but what's it like to be a X race or races person who is also experiencing questions about their gender identity, also questions about their sexuality, also questions about their environment and access to resources. Equity is really about knowing lived experiences and seeing where there are differences and where there are privileges, where there are marginalizations as well as subjugations. And so to only look at race and to only look at racial trauma also kind of misses a large part of identity formation. I also think that there's a lot in the news, especially in the Atlanta area, about human trafficking and sex trafficking and what that means for children. Also, race at the intersections of immigration, and so unaccompanied minors as well as accompanied minors who have been through traumas that people who don't have those lived experiences can't even imagine. So the intersections, the experiences at the intersections are what we're trying to really get to understand a very clear or have a very clear view of what might be the foundation of the anxiety, or the heart issues or the headaches or the sleeplessness that come into our offices. We have to be able to get a really good understanding of the cultural context, which includes class and gender and sexuality and all the parts of identity.
Yeah, so much there that you guys have shared. I mean, I'm definitely hearing that, there's this dance that providers have to do all of the time. But so understanding the importance and the influence of race, particularly in this country, given our history here and how that plays out for a lot of different racial groups in different ways, but also not making that the only thing, because then obviously you're creating their identity a bit for them, or giving the weight to it that maybe it doesn't have, maybe it's something else that's really affecting how they're interacting with you or whatever, but making sure that you're putting that in as one of your assessments and understanding that can be a high influential point. When I think of it, something analogous to maybe what providers understand in general, like, so as an internist, I'm like, well, I'll screen for a lot of things, right? I'm always going to check your blood pressure. I'm going to check your cholesterol. I'm going to check that. So someone has, diabetes and also migraines. And this, so when they're showing up with me, the question is, which one of those is really sort of ruling the day a bit more for them? And that changes over time, right? And there's an assessment, a reassessment, and then there's me making sure I'm asking them, what is going on for you? What is it that you're experiencing? What thing is driving things for you? And then obviously putting it together with all of the information that we're trained to make assessments on and look at, but making sure that we know that's an important factor. Like their migraines might be very important to them. Like sometimes the thing that I don't think is the most important in the room is the most important to them that day, right? Their new foot pain because they can't walk around and they tweak their ankle and they have a 2-year-old, like that's important to them. And I'm really trying to make sure their kidney disease is okay, but today this is what they want to talk about more so. But it's like putting it in the milieu of everything and understanding any one of those things can be very important at a given point, and to not define them by any one thing, right? It's why in internal medicine, they tell us not to call people diabetics anymore. It's like a person with diabetes, my patient has, right? So it's like, it's another thing I'm helping them with and to manage. So it's like your assessments there need to go with everything that's in the room, and understanding that you shouldn't push one thing to the front necessarily as well, like that interplay should happen. And I think that happens a lot more with different people's pieces of their identity and the different roles that they play and what's really playing the biggest role. I just think we don't get trained on how to look at how race might be really impacting that, especially with kids, because it shows up a little like sort of less developed and less articulated for providers. Can you speak a little bit more, because we want to make sure we leave people with tools, and the time's gone by so fast, but some age appropriate strategies for sort of thoughtfully addressing race and racial trauma with your patient, with the caregiver, for younger children as well, and tying that into some suggested resources. I know there have been some questions that come in, and like next steps, because what's really important here is that providers do their own continuing work, right? They have to look at their own biases, remove those. They have to look at how do they make these assessments and get this information in their trusting relationship with their clients and patients, and continually improve upon that. So whatever you can speak to for people as well, so that they can do that continuing work, I'll leave it open here for that. I'll start with you, Dr. Brown James.
Okay, yeah, so I think we touched on this a little bit earlier when we talked about age appropriate resources. With the younger ones, it's helpful to have use a story, and there are tons of books out there. Like one that comes to mind really quick off the top of my head is This Is America, right? And it's the story of a young Black child that experienced racial profiling from police officers and stuff. So you could use it in a story. You can find out what the kid knows already about it. What have they been hearing? And then have the conversation from there. It's really important to have conversations with parents as well to find out, for one, what are they exposing the kids to? You know, again, whether wittingly or unwittingly, and also understanding what their perception of what's going on, because the parents might have a very different experience than their child. For one, developmentally, generationally, you know, there could be some differences. For example, when you think about someone that migrated to this country, for example, in my work and in the literature, it's very clear that a person's experiences with race, if they weren't born in this country, although they may still experience it, their perception of it is very different, right? So for one, they may not notice it right away, right? And then even if and when they do, they have this battle of, well, I'm so grateful to be here that I don't want to complain about it. So kind of minimizing their own experiences and not understanding how it could be attributing to adverse mental health and or physical health, because there's definitely an intersection between race-based trauma and mental and physical health, you know, that body, mind, spirit connection. It's all connected. And some of the patients that are clients that we may see that presents with the cholesterol and high blood pressure and stuff, really understanding that there could be an environmental link to that, including race-based experiences. So talking with them from an age appropriate stance, but also providing the necessary resources based on what is available to them too, because of course not everyone has access to everything. So considering the role of the access financially, economically, what they may have access to, what free resources, if necessary, we can provide to them can also be very helpful.
That's great. As well for you, Dr. Smith, some of the age appropriate strategies and considerations, and then resources that have been helpful to you or you think are helpful to point other people to.
Yeah, I am really invested in the part that building pride and empowerment plays on children and adolescents. I feel like this is outside of even race. I mean, I think that it encompasses everything. I think, again, you know, to look at age and these age groups and the ways in which they are disempowered kind of everywhere can really help us see where we can, as providers, help to empower them. So, you know, first, for example, asking the child or adolescent what's been going on versus, you know, children. So really their parents or the adults in their life. How do we engage and in our engagement provide a model for being able to empower and from a place of power, empower them. So I think that we have to be pretty aware of that. We have to be not only aware of our biases, but what it's like to, you know, be a 7-year-old and to, you know, have this experience and not really know who to go to. Again, learning how to be that safe person. So I, again, feel like the responsibility is on the adults to become knowledgeable about the lived experiences of children and adolescents as they grapple with race in this country and maybe even countries of origin. And so, you know, there's so many different places that adults can learn. But first, I will go back to the pride part. So there's so many different like books. And I mean, now we are seeing a plethora of just literature that shows representation. I feel like representation is the way in which to build pride. And I mean, we could have a whole library of books about people of color, about indigenous cultures, about people who are going through the process of seeking asylum, for example. I mean, there's so many resources that people are being empowered themselves to write about. And so, you know, a simple Google is your friend, a simple Google search of, you know, age appropriate books for children around diversity or multiculturalism. the summer of 2020 kind of gave us some gifts, which were, people putting together lists of books. And one that comes to mind that is an amazing book for children and adolescents of all ages and adults, because I also have learned a lot, is I Am Enough by Grace Byers. And I just feel like that is coming from a place of the main character is a young Black girl, but there's so many different points about diversity in there, and that there is a place and space for all of us, and that we're enough, and that we don't have to be like somebody else. So I really love that book, and so there are plenty others. I also am a social media head, so I'm going to give you a few places to, specifically Instagram. The Social Justice Parenting is a really great resource. She does a really great job of talking about what it means for parents to learn how to, be conscious of what's going on in the lives of their kids, and not just, if your child is a person of color, even, she talks about personally, her children are biracial. And so just even being able to talk about the experience of multiculturalism and interracial relationships, and what all of that means is happening within the literature and on social media as well. The Conscious Kid is another really great resource, and they don't just talk about race and ethnicity. They talk about all different types of identities at the intersections, and it's just about how do you help contribute to a society of people who are conscious about culture and differences and diversity, and create equitable solutions. And then the last is Latinx Parenting, which has been a really great resource for even me, as I try to figure out how to engage, with my 2-year-old around race, and how to instill pride, but then also socialize her to know what her lived experiences will most likely be as a dark-skinned Black child. I will put those in the chat for those that missed what I added.
Oh, they're ahead of you. They're talking about it and dropping it in the chat already. They were asking.
Wonderful, great.
I figured once you were done talking, you're really good about going back and looking at that. But so there might be some in there that were missed, but some people already answered some of the questions in there, typing out the name of the books. But thank you for all of those resources as well. And there, I will drop in one other social media piece, and it's from Dr. Kendi's book as well, but there is actually a channel called How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? That's on Instagram, and they just drop a lot of different book titles, resources, podcasts, other, principles, things to consider for the day, right? Like thoughts for the day, ways to engage yourself around continuing the work and just holding yourself accountable to that. So I think it just offers a range of things as well for people to engage on. And I did a misstep. I actually thought this was over sooner than it was, but that means that we have a little bit more time. So that's good. So we can go back to a couple of other topics and still sprinkle in resources and things as we go as well. But there are other topics that have also come up in the chat, and they were things that we had also discussed before the panel today, even with other experts who weren't necessarily able to be here today, but so 2 different topics. So I'll start with one because we've touched on it already and we can expand, which is a little bit more around the political climate and the impact that might have on BIPOC children, or things that are seen, in the news or reported by elected leaders or officials, or things that they say, right, that get a lot of, press and media coverage and seems to bleed into every part of life, and how that disproportionately affects BIPOC children in a certain way, or they might process it as well with how they form trust or identity or thoughts around themselves, and even trust in their leadership, on providing that safety or environments for them. I'm thinking around, the recent images with Haitian immigrants at the border. I found it personally triggering because, having studied African-American history quite a bit as well, and just American history, and the fact that those same very images you could have rewound history 100 years ago. And that's like how police started with like slave patrols and things like that. So and so I'm wondering, for young people who are processing that, I'm also thinking about, the hate crimes that, rose for Asian Americans during our pandemic, and the language that was used around that, and the targeting of them, and like what people, young, even Asian women who had disproportionate violence against them during this period of time, how they might be processing that, thinking about that, their own personal physical safety, just walking on the street, the way those attacks were happening, those sorts of things, and how we know that those impact younger people, and how we might ask them about it, address it, and understand that that's, playing actively in their life with their levels of daily anxiety sometimes at points. Dr. Smith, can you speak a little bit more about that? Because you touched on it earlier.
Sure, absolutely. I think that, again, we, and I really love Dr. Brown James's suggestion around like just knowing what our children are consuming, and then also how we talk about it. So that's kind of like first and foremost that, a lot of these images and things, especially without context, can be a lot to take in. And, especially given if we're talking about a Haitian family or a Haitian child who has also been hearing about the devastation in Haiti, and also the ways in which, even family members might have been experiencing that. We're talking about layers upon layers of things that are so hard to understand that it can cause, even more of these, it can impact them in so many different ways. So what we don't want to do as the adults in these kids' lives is to add to the kind of like misinformation or the just complexity, right? To say, yes, you can have access to this, but I don't know how, and I won't explain it is really harmful. And just because we don't necessarily know how, right? But even if we ourselves as the adults, even if we are like, parents or aunts, uncles in the lives of children who are also experiencing this climate, to even talk about what it means for us and what it does for us. I do believe that children and adolescents do need to learn how to talk about what is going on and what happens internally. So my experiences of racial trauma can be passed vicariously, and the misunderstanding of it can also be passed. So if I can be the person to say, this is really, it's scary, it's hurtful. It reminds me of, some things that I have learned, or crying that occurred as soon as, seeing those pictures, like, the sadness, being able to talk about that in ways that we would any other areas of grief or loss or trauma. We have to learn how to do this in an age appropriate way. I think also learning how they are receiving this, right? So if they do hear it or if they do see it, what do they think about it, right? For what we know is that, from kindergarten usually up, they are having racialized experiences. They are hearing and seeing things. And so to understand how they're making sense of it, what do you think about this? And to also say, I need to, and I want to protect you from this as long as I possibly can. You'll have time to learn about this. Until then, let's learn about Haitian culture and Haitian people. Let's go try to have some, Haitian food. Let's listen to some Haitian music, which then helps us to, whether we're Haitian or not, have a counter narrative that is age appropriate. So if they do see these images and they're seeing and hearing the language of, Haitian migrants being criminals, then they actually have a different narrative. And to say, like, just as we would anyone who is in need. How do we talk about people who are in need or who aren't as fortunate? Or as we talk about gratitude, are we also talking about the lived experiences of people who are a part of natural disasters and devastation within their home country, and why they would need to be here? What does safety mean? And just being able to deconstruct it for ourselves to better learn what's going on for us, so that we aren't just passing it without the knowledge that it's there. If we're angry, if it's hurtful, that we're hearing and seeing these images, again, age appropriately, what is that like? What's it like to be an adult? Because I can't imagine what it's like to be a child or an adolescent trying to make sense of. I can't even make sense of it.
Certainly. Yeah, that's why I acknowledge my own personal triggering, even, knowing a lot, being able to process, it's still, you have to acknowledge those emotions, those feelings, and work through them as well, or whatever, when those images are just in your face, right? And like you were saying, creating a counter narrative to help you. So in all these ways, buffers against sort of the insults of the world and environment and other people, but like, what can you empower the child with in order to buffer against those things? Dr. Brown James, you touch on this as well around, immigrant populations, different images and things that might be in the external environment that are really affecting the child and their development. Can you say more about how we can look at that and help them with those issues?
Yes, and like I mentioned before, trying to censor or limit their exposure to it as much as possible, but also having conversations about it. Someone asked a great question as it relates to like images and the media in the question and answer portion, that asked pretty much how, when a Black child or Black person goes missing, why do they get less coverage than when a white person goes missing, right? And how do I answer that question? And I think that question is such an important question, but if the child is asking, then that is a perfect opportunity. The door is open to have a conversation about equity, inclusion, white privilege, and all of these things, because the reality is people of color don't usually get a lot of coverage, when that stuff happens. And so really using that opportunity to have a conversation with them about it and explaining what is privilege, whether it's white privilege, economic privilege, and, so forth and so forth, but they are noticing it. So helping them to understand, and even helping them to not just understand, but think about what can they do, how could they spread awareness, what is within their control that they can help to contribute to being an advocate or to being a social change agent. But also, you had mentioned about the role of politics, right? That's another topic that people don't want to talk about or don't like to talk about. But the reality is it's a part of the intersection. You cannot separate it, and in the last, 10 years, politics has been very, very interesting, and upsetting, and such a reminder of how much work needs to be done. And I know for me personally, like in the last couple of years, it was a shock, like, whoa, I feel like I'm living in the pre-civil rights era here, right? And, and even like you mentioned, our Asian American sisters and brothers, or, friends and colleagues and family members that have been targeted because of messages in the media and associating COVID-19 with, coming, China and people, all of the stuff that has been going on. I have had Asian American friends that are very, very close to me that have been personally impacted by that, right? And just thinking about just all of the stuff that has happened, associated with, even when President Obama was president, when President Donald Trump was president, and just all of the things that are happening now, and how it is an eye-opening experience that there's a lot of things that can contribute to race-based and other types of traumatic experiences. And how can we best support people And again, if they're asking the questions, then they want to have a conversation. And even if you don't have an answer, practicing that cultural humility that we talked about. I don't know the answer, right? But let me find out for you. Or can we explore this together? You know, what are some solutions that you think, what would you like to see happen? You know, even putting it back on them in a sense to kind of get some more information about what they're thinking and what they would like to see happen. And, you know, if it's even practical to do, you know, so those are just some of the thoughts that comes to mind. But there were some other questions that we didn't have a chance to address in the chat that I think are very relevant to what we're
Yeah.
talking about.
I'm going to try and, weave some of those in as well, because since we had a little bit more time, and piggyback a bit on what you guys have brought up a little bit, which is like, I appreciate Dr. Brown James, what you just said about what can we do to explore, or how can you be part of the solution, right? Like understanding this injustice or inequity exists, not necessarily internalizing it like something's wrong with you, but like something needs to be helped in this world to have that inequity not exist. Like what are you going to do as a developing child and person around it? Like what are your thoughts, et cetera? And to me, that paired really nicely, Dr. Smith, with what you said around building pride and empowering kids at different ages so that they can, in their own, with their own internal strength and their own development, also buffer against these things that they're just bound to encounter, right, as they grow up. And understanding that we're all either mothers of aunts or of children of color. I have biracial children in my family as well, those different things. And a little bit of personal texture around what do we say to the kids in our lives, and counsel them with how to do some of those things, how to be self-empowered, how to have, manage their own internal conversations around this, to see like, what is it that you want to do to change things, and how could you do that? How is it that you talk to the kids in your life? I know, Dr. Smith, you have a little one, but you have other nieces and nephews and things. And how is it that you address that in your life?
I still address it with my 2-year-old. Again, it's just based in her age, and so this whole conscious parenting thing came because of her. I mean, at the end of the day, her resilience, I'm learning to say resilience instead of stubborn, that that's something that teaches me to have a different perspective, right? That I'm not the expert, I'm not the one with power in this relationship. So at the end of the day, not only can she teach me, I can teach her to use terms like I am Black, and what that means, and that it's not something to hush, but that, yes, just like I'm a girl, and to yell that from the rooftops that girls run the world, that there is, Black girl magic. And then that's something that she can absolutely say what she wears and all of the things that pour into her. My 10-year-old bonus son, how to talk to him about what it means to be a brown child in a classroom, and to have conversations about with us, with his parents, about what he might need or what he might not understand or what he might be seeing. So asking, just outright, tell me about school today, what was it like? Have you all been talking about what's been going on in the world? Do you know who George Floyd is? Have you heard about that? Even if we are not exposing him to some of these things, school is exposing him to some of these things. And so, what's that like? Or even to, I remember bringing him to a park and having a conversation with a Black police officer who he had a dog, and a police dog, and he wanted to take a picture with the police dog. And before the picture, the police officer took his hood off. And so, number one, watch your boundaries. But number two, can you help me understand why you did that? And the conversation that just ensued, and he was there, was actually very interesting, because as a Black police officer, the ways in which he knows a young Black child with a hood on will be perceived is something that he wants to work on, right? Not from necessarily, he wasn't talking about from the system's perspective, but how can he work work with young Black boys to know that this is the perception. You can wear whatever you want and be empowered to do that, but also know that there are people out there that have a different perception of what that means. And while I may not have agreed with his decision to do that, I thought that it was a really helpful conversation that my son was exposed to, and I thought that was awesome. So I think that there are different ways in which, you know, we can that we can really engage in conversations and just kind of like let them lead, and to say like, your perception, your perspective, your experiences are just as important as mine or the ones that we hear so much about. I too have biracial nieces and a nephew, and to be able to, I mean, now they're, you know, in their 20s, so, you know, I'm able to outright, you know, talk to them about their experiences. But when they were younger and they were saying that they were always teased because their hair was different, and or because their skin color was different and they were being raised in a predominantly white area, what was that like, you know, for me? They were, you know, 15 and 16 asking these questions. And, you know, I didn't know, you know, what to say. We're very close in age. So it was very hard for me to conceptualize my own experiences, let alone let, you know, talk to them about it. So the question back, like Dr. Brown James was saying, like, you know, how would you do this differently if you were, you know, president of the United States, which is speaking again, hope of being something that the world tells them or society tells them that they might not be able to be. If you were, or when you become, what would you do differently? And you know what? I don't know any more of what I would do differently than they do. And honestly, children and adolescents have much more like freedom to think about things that that we as adults don't. And so it's just like prioritizing their experiences and saying, you know what? I honestly don't know either. And, you know, it's also a painful experience for me too. I was hurt in this way as well. But then for people who don't share the same experiences, just being open to, you know, saying that we don't have an answer. We're not going to have an answer at the end of this conversation. None of us are. And to be okay with that and to say we're simply just having a conversation, just as we would, you know, a conversation about other impacts on their life, just as we would conversations about, you know, I don't know, the music or video games. What are some other things that you're consuming? And what do you think about those things? Help me understand your perspective and your lived experience is really like the overall question that we want to ask, that all of us can ask.
Yeah, really, really good point. Dr. Brown James, how in your life do you talk to the kids in your life around these different issues as well?
Yeah, just, you know, if they ask a question or bringing it up with them, you know, sometimes we'll watch movies or we will read a book or something and have a conversation, have some type of dialogue about it, you know, or doing it through play is also very helpful, like I mentioned before. So just normalizing the topics and the conversations with them is really important. I know one of the things that the kids in my life, both personally and professionally, have been asking a lot about is, why are people saying that Black Lives Matter is bad, right? So we have a conversation about that, how unfortunately it has turned into a lot of myths. It turned into a political thing, you know, you're on the left or the right, depending on what side of the fence you're on. And then because of that movement, which is a social justice movement for not just people of color, but any person from a marginalized group, you know, then we have the rebuttals like the All Lives Matter or the Police Lives Matter. Well, of course, all lives matter, and of course police lives matter, right? That's not the issue. The issue at hand is that caused this movement was that Black lives were being treated very differently, which has been going on from the beginning of time. That's not anything new. So having a conversation with them about history and how people were treated, you know, back before the civil rights era and even now, what are some of the similarities? And yes, we do have more quote unquote rights in this country, but unfortunately, frequently those rights are being violated. So, and talk with them about ways that they can be violated. And also, again, going back to what I said earlier about what can they do, right? Helping them to understand that it is not okay for any person, regardless of who they are, what job they have, to be treated in a hateful way, or to be treated in a mean way, or, you know, assaulted or anything like that. So even bringing it back to bullying, because with kids, that's something that they can understand. Like, what, have you been bullied, or have you noticed a friend being bullied? And what do you do? What can you do? What can you say? You know, and just helping them to understand that they're not powerless in these situations, and, you know, talking with them about a way that they can practically and safely, you know, perhaps stand up and bring some type of change, whether it's reporting it to an authority figure, or standing in the gap for someone, or even providing some resources or education to help people to understand why what they're saying is not helpful, or is not legal, because a lot of times it's illegal and is not productive.
Those are all really good points. I share those same thoughts with you, and I will add on to the conversation of having like multiracial children in the family, especially because, I mean, I think that's really apropos, because I don't know if people remember the 2020 census numbers that came out that said that, you know, there was a big increase in the number of Americans that identified themselves as multiracial, or not just one race or the other, right? So I think this is a conversation that's going to come up in all areas of life. It's going to walk into your room as well, as a provider and caregiver, as well, as far as a backdrop to how people are identifying themselves and what they're dealing with because of that identification. And I think, you know, as the being an aunt to those two nieces in my family, and they had a white mother. And so really trying to have her understand, though, that like the world still looks at them as not white, and what that means, because she largely, and this often happens, right, like integrated them with her family more so, right? Like her mom helped her raise them as little ones, et cetera. And that often happens. As she was the primary caregiver for the amazing, but having to help her understand, you know, also things like how to do their hair, how to think about that, how to understand that when they get feedback with the largely white community that they lived in, and how their friends would be that from the schools they were going to, and they get something negative back that, you know, you don't quite fit here, or something interesting, or people pulling on their hair and making fun of them or something like that, how it is that she could have constructive conversations with them around that, you know, obviously integrating in her father as well too, but these were girls in particular, and how their mom can maybe talk to them about things that women concern themselves more with tends to, you know, hair is one of the things, and how she could be, you know, productive with that, empowering to them in that, how she could educate herself and how she should, even that was not an experience at all of hers or any of her close family members, how she really needed to reach out and help her daughters with that and their own identity formation, and them feeling empowered, and what could they do, and what appropriate responses could they have back that were really self-affirming, and those kinds of things as well. So I definitely think, you know, all of these things touch us on a very personal level. And as providers, we can take that into the room. I mean, we do take that into the room. All of our biases and experiences we take into the room as people, like anything, and to understand which ones can be helpful. What are the certain principles that you use with your loved ones, and that empathy point that you can have with the patient that comes in that also presents something similar, that you can say, well, you know, actually I've dealt with that, or I've had that in my family, or talked about that. Let me ask you some questions. Like I'd ask questions that I would have asked my niece about it, right? In a way. And from that point of view, understanding that there are struggles and there are things that they want to discuss, you know, in an age appropriate way at that. So I think those are really important things for us to always consider, because that's just going to be more and more the case in America as well, as what's playing around in people's identities with that piece. And I did see one note. I'll give a shout out to somebody who wrote The Deepest Well as a book and resource, and it's a really good one. I personally love that one as well, because being from California, I still sit on one of the advisory committees for Dr. Burke Harris, and that was her, you know, she's the author, and that's her life's work. And like we were referring to before, the average childhood experiences with ACEs. And she has a complete program, being the first Surgeon General in California around ACEs that are funded through to have providers with the with the goal to have providers increase their education. So there is standardized continuing education, and I'll drop the website in where you can still take that CE credit as well for training, and then also standardized screening tools around ACEs as well from all of her research, and a lot of that's referred to in that book as well too, on like actual tools for you to use for screening and asking some of those difficult questions that are evidence-based. So I know the providers would really like that as well. So I definitely, that's a great book as well. We're nearing the end of time, I think for real this time. And so I just want to make sure I open it up. I think I've looked at some of the questions and seen, I think the only one maybe we haven't answered, we're a little bit around, and I tried to do this just with my discussion just now with my nieces, was how do you as a provider, maybe when you think there's like negative impacts from how parents have been discussing things with kids, and stereotypes or other things as well, everything comes from the external environment to how they're dealing with family life, et cetera. As a provider, how do you deal with some of that when that's in the room without being, inappropriate or overstepping boundaries? Providers are concerned about that. So if you guys have any notes around that as our last question, I'll toss that to you, Dr. Smith.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that again, as we begin to make questions, assessment, conversations, intervention around racial trauma and implicit racial bias commonplace, then we learn how to have conversations about the health and well-being of children when they are hearing positive things about themselves. And so my guess is, and I did read that question, so if I'm off point about answering it, then somehow let me know. But I really do think that the goal is not to have a debate with an adult in the lives of children, but to again talk about best practices when we are attempting to make an impression on children and adolescents about what it is that they're going to encounter, right? So I believe that children of color, white children, multiracial children, and adolescents need to be conceptualizing race just as they would any type of experience. Their identity is just as important as what it is that they're doing or maladaptive ways that they are coping with, stressors in their life. Their identity and their identity development as children and as adolescents are just as important. So if we have a lens of what's wrong, then we're going to be stunted in the questions that we ask. If we are helping parents change what's wrong or what did you do wrong or what's the problem to what happened, what has happened to you, what happened at school today, what happened when you went to blah, 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 then we actually are able to make more space for conversations that, we may not necessarily, or things that we may not have known that were going on. I also think that we need practice, right? Our clients and our patients should not be the first time that we are learning how to ask questions about race and to talk about the very real issue of systemic racism in our society, of racial bias that we ourselves also need to explore. We should be doing this in other ways. We should be getting knowledge and gathering information, not just about other people and other cultures, but ourselves. So one, question that I would ask everyone listening is, what is it like to be engaged in, watching this conversation happen between three Black women, between, three women who are comfortable talking about race and, well, comfortable, I'll use that loosely. I don't want to speak for y'all or me, I guess. But also, what is it like to hear the terms Black, white privilege, all of the things that are so ingrained in these conversations that we have to say, we have to be at least comfortable within the discomfort to push through and to have conversations? How are we talking to our partners? How are we talking to the other adults in our life, our families, our parents, who have a completely different perspective in a very different era? How are we having these conversations? If we're not having these conversations, then we're not going to know how to have them with perfect strangers and with people at our jobs. We have to be clear about not only who we're surrounded by, but also, is there friction that we are experiencing that makes us look inward or even outward for more information? Are we doing our own research? Do we know what systemic racism it is and how it impacts the populations of people that we serve? What about our friends? What about our partners? If we are in intercultural or interracial relationships, with most relationships are at least intercultural. If we're talking about differences in age, religion, class, gender, all of those things, there's a lot of differences among the cultures that we've been, raised in. Ethnicity is another major identity factor. So how are we having conversations with people as we begin to learn something different? Can we even broach the topic of race with our grandparents? Can we even broach the topic of race with people that are friends, who we've been friends with for, generations? And if we can't, and then we can't learn how to do that, then we will absolutely continue to struggle with having these conversations with patients and clients.
Agreed. Definitely the personal work in there. Dr. Brown James, I want to give you room as well to say, parting words sort of in this area, and anything else around how we can counsel and help other people here.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I want to say in closing is that in my experience, right, most people of color do not have a problem talking about race because it is at the forefront of everything that we do. We're constantly reminded of it, whether we want to be reminded of it or not. Like the white guy that comes to my house in a very affluent community and asks me, am I the homeowner, when I just talked to him on the phone and told him that I will be answering the door when he comes, so we're constantly reminded of it. So, and like I said earlier, bringing it up helps people to let their guard down and know that you're safe. You see them for who they are and you're willing to have the conversation. You're willing to learn about their lived experiences. And if they don't want to talk about it, or if it's not an issue for them, they will tell you as well. But most people are appreciative that you even see them in that way, and positively, and that you're concerned, and like, I want to consider your race, your culture in our work together. Whether you're a medical provider or a mental health provider, it helps them to feel like you really have their interests at heart. You see them for who they are. Like I said, you are a culturally humble provider, and you're not going to approach their treatment from a cookie cutter approach, but a culturally competent and a culturally sensitive approach.
Definitely. Thank you guys so much for all of the wonderful things that you shared. There's so much there. I know there's things to pass on in a follow-up email, but I'm going to pass it over to Rachel or Meryl to clean up all those things. Thank you everyone for joining us today as well. Rich conversation. We'll have more. Thank you.
Agreed. Yes, such a rich discussion. You guys are getting a lot of love in the chat, so you'll have to look over there at all the praise coming your way. Just a couple closing thoughts on my end. I'll be sending out the recording as well as the CE survey and the survey about what you might like to see as an additional topic next time. So please be sure to complete both of those surveys, one for CE credit and then one just giving feedback to the panelists. Meryl, anything you have to say on your end?
Just thank you. I mean, eternally grateful. Dr. Malloy, Dr. Brown James, Dr. Smith, amazing. But I also wanted the participants today, thank you for sharing also. What incredible comments and personal experiences that you've opened yourself up to sharing there. So we will continue this conversation. That is our commitment. And to create, safety and safe conversations and honest conversations with young people is our commitment, by making ourselves better and getting smarter along the way as well. So thank you, everyone. We wish everybody a lot of health and well-being to carry this forward. And we will see you soon. Please keep in touch with us. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
A great one.